So we are now live. So go ahead, Barbara.
I want to welcome everybody to the Shenandoah County Historical Society's September program meeting, which we would rather have had in person, but this is what we've got. And we all learn as we go along. This, of course, is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. I'm Barbara Adamson, president of the Shenandoah County Historical Society. And on behalf of all our board members, I want to welcome everyone. Zach Hottel, our county archivist, is going to give us a presentation about the women's suffrage movement, and particularly in Shenandoah County. Last end of January, early February, before everything fell apart, we discovered that there were two register lists that still remained in the county from 1920 of women who went and registered to vote from Newmarket and from Woodstock. And that was really exciting. It just led to a lot of other research that Zach has done, and I know he's going to tell us about that. And you're going to hear lots of familiar names. So much fun. So Zach, I'll let you take it from here.
All right, so thank you, Barbara. What we're going to do tonight is hopefully discuss what it means to be involved in the women's suffrage movement here in Shenandoah County, and what it meant to be a woman voter in that first election in 1920. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We are going to be sharing the presentation screen with everyone, both on Zoom and on Facebook. So we'll have that up here in a minute. If you have any questions, we can either save those live for the end, or you can type them in the chat or the comments section. And we'll be monitoring that and hopefully sharing those when we get to the end. Or if you have any technical issues or anything like that, also just include that in the comment section. And we'll try to, at the end, if someone does want to ask a live question, get them unmuted so that they can do that. But until then, try to leave your screen muted. All right, now for the attempt to go to the correct PowerPoint. Let's hope this works. Okay, can everyone see the Votes for Women's Suffrage program?
Yes.
Our IT can see it. So again, my name is Zach Hottel. I'm the archivist here at the Shenandoah County Library. And like Barbara mentioned, this program is designed to examine women's suffrage in our county, both how it came about, how it was practiced, and what some of its limits were. So the suffrage movement in general. So this is not an analysis of suffrage. I really know very little about the suffrage movement in general in terms of it being my expertise, but we are going to cover just a couple things that are going to help us maybe understand a few of the local things as we talk about them. So in July of 1848, at Seneca Falls is the first designated suffrage convention, which was a large meeting of women and men who were interested in granting the right to vote to women. Now, this is definitely not the first attempt of giving women the right to vote, or the first people that supported the right to vote. That dates to colonial periods, when some women advocated for the right to vote. Some localities granted that. But this is what's really considered the birth of our modern women's suffrage movement, was the Seneca Falls conventions, July 19 and 20, 1848. The next major milestone is in 1890, what's called the National Women's Suffrage Association is formed. Now, this is the first united national organization dedicated to women's suffrage. There were several other large organizations that had a broad following across the country before this, but this is the point where we get where there's now one big organization dedicated to women's suffrage. And they're able to then take their resources and put them wholly into the effort to get women the right to vote. Now, several states do grant women the right to vote before 1920, before uh, the constitutional amendment that legalizes suffrage across the country. But the big holdup was what was called Southern resistance. So a constitutional amendment requires 3/4 of states um, to vote to support the amendment. And the South, including Virginia, um, through their resistance, was able to block that by basically acknowledging that they would not support that. So the national amendment never goes very far until you enter the 20th century because of efforts in the South. One of the big things that changes that and changes some of the national narrative is World War One. So during World War One, a lot of men go overseas, um, so women go to work. Not as much as in the Second World War, but still in impressive numbers for the time. They even served to a limited degree in some of the armed forces. So there's this realization that women can now do more than just what was expected of them. And there's also suddenly this realization among the suffrage movements that they can harness America's fight for freedom and democracy and the right to vote internationally to gain support internationally or nationally for the suffrage movement. So a lot of the protests that occur in this period tie into the war effort. And really that helps bring some changes. It brings support from the president. It brings support from more congressmen, from more senators. And then finally in 1919, the proposed amendment is sent to the states. And finally, on June 14th, 1919, it passes the Senate. It's sent to the states. And finally, Tennessee becomes the last state to ratify it on August 18th, 1920. And this means that November of that year is going to be the first election where women throughout the country can participate. Because, like I said, some states had already granted that right to women. So this is the first really national, the time when nationally women could vote across the country. Virginia does not approve that amendment until 1952, when we finally support equal suffrage for women, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, across the country. So that's just a quick overview of the suffrage movement in general, just to try to help us understand as we kind of move forward. So then the question is, how did women's suffrage work in Shenandoah County? How did the movement to grant women the right to vote? And this quote from the Shenandoah Valley, which was on September 14th, 1916, that this movement, talking about suffrage, does not seem very popular in our valley. And that is the narrative that is kind of handed down through different historic interpretation, that it was not popular in the terms of popular enough for people to take an effort to support suffrage, but instead was almost something that was just ignored until the time comes. But we're going to find out the reality is a little bit different. So the first thing we want to talk about is the resistance. The resistance in Shenandoah County to women being granted the right to vote. And we know that that resistance had to be fairly strong, at least in terms of the leaders of the community and in terms of the newspapers. And that's our major resource that we look at when conducting research, is our local newspaper collections. And they're full of disparaging articles about the suffrage movement. So here's two of them. One is from June, on the left is June 3rd, 1892. So you have to see that suffrage is on local radar even, 20 years really before um, equal suffrage is guaranteed by the Constitution. Um, and it talks about, it's kind of a stereotypical article about from these newspapers talking about why women shouldn't have the right to vote. Um, and it's basically saying um, that women are going to kind of be like take charge if they're granted the right to vote, and that men almost will be emasculated by women granting the right to vote, that they're going to be kind of controlled by their wives. So there's no reason to give women the right to vote. The other one here, the women's suffrage now up to the states, that's a later one. That's June 11th, 1919, when we're in the middle of this debate over the constitutional amendment. And it kind of summarizes there in its first sentence. It says, the women of Shenandoah County have never been overly enthusiastic about women's suffrage. And that's kind of the narrative that during this debate that the newspapers try to create, is that women in the county just are not interested in voting. Like, they've got enough to do with their homes and their children that they don't want to vote. So what the newspapers do, and I'm sure in collaboration with other local leaders, they create this narrative that women just don't want to vote. They also ignore it. Obviously, as it becomes national news, it's harder to do. So there are newspaper coverage of the national debate, but there are no newspaper articles about local suffrage movements, meetings, women, any of that. And for a local newspaper at the time to not report on something that we're going to find out later happened has to be very deliberate, because they reported on everything. So if there's no report on the suffrage, it has to be a deliberate effort to just ignore it. They also, like I said, have these announcements that women are uninterested. And there's also family connections. There's private pressure, because no one wants to, in public, say, well, women shouldn't have the right to vote, because that kind of creates a bad image. But if in family connections and private, you can put pressure on people to not vote or not support suffrage, then that's a good way to resist it without publicly coming out against equal suffrage for women. But even though there's this idea from the newspaper that women were just in no way interested in voting, in 1920, when they finally do in Shenandoah County, they go to the polls in huge numbers. So these are just two stereotypical articles from that period. The Harrisville one on the left is from the Herald on October 6, 1920. And it reports that in Harrisville, the tiny community of Harrisville, that the women of the precinct kept the registrar busy an entire week registering, and that his house was crowded. So for a tiny community, searches from a tiny community all the way through our towns, our larger population center. And we know that on October 7th, 1920, the Shenandoah Valley reported that 2,067 women had paid the poll tax to vote in 1920. Now, there's no way of knowing how many women actually did vote, because it's not reported out that way. But 2,067 women paying the poll tax means they had registered and means that they had paid money to vote. So most likely they were going to go ahead and vote. And that's a huge number for Shenandoah County, which only had about 10,000 residents in 1920. And in comparison, the city of Lynchburg, a much larger community, had about the same number of women who paid that poll tax. So we can tell from this that for whatever reason, women in Shenandoah County really did want to vote, because as soon as they get the opportunity from throughout the county, they go to the polls. They get registered, they pay the tax, and we're assuming almost all of these people, if possible, went and voted. So how did we get to this point? How did we get to this point where suddenly we have these women voting who, according to the newspapers, were not at all interested in being voters, being involved politically? And the reality is, there had to be something hidden there. Because if you look beyond, we have to look beyond those headlines to discover really what went on and what set the groundwork for all these women voting. So we kind of dug deeper in our analysis to try to figure out, was there really this lack of interest in voting, lack of interest in the suffrage league, the suffrage movement? And we found that it was just really hidden in ways that we had not found with anything else. So here's one of the earliest items that we were able to pick up that shows that maybe, just maybe, there was this stronger desire to vote than the newspaper headlines were willing to admit. And this is August 11th, 1916. And it has this little note in an article about the Fisher's Hill reunion, which was for Confederate veterans. It was this big thing with like a fair and food, and all these veterans and all these members of the community came, and the governor came and spoke, and there were thousands of people there. And there's this little end of a sentence that says, "There was the little girl with showy parasol, upon which is inscribed votes for women." And that's all that's mentioned. But that leads one to question, what does this really mean? Obviously, there was a woman there who made a big enough impression on the newspaper to get this little mention of votes for women. And it turns out that this woman was most likely a woman named Ellen Robinson. Now, Ellen Robinson is not from Shenandoah County. She's from the Hampton Roads area, and where she became a member of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. But for some reason, we're not sure why, her mother was living in Strasburg. And when her mother got sick in about 1915, 1916, Ellen came here to take care of her, and then became the leader of the entire region's Equal Suffrage League. And in the history of that suffrage league, it's reported that Ellen Robinson, on this date when they had the Fisher's Hill reunion, spoke to the crowd about suffrage. And it reported it was about 15,000 people, which is backed up by the newspaper accounts. So somewhere between simply being a woman with basically a sign that says votes for women and a major address as recorded by the Suffrage League history, we know that Ellen Robinson did something to attract the attention of all the people in attendance at that reunion that day in support for votes for women. Enough that she shows up in local newspapers and in that larger history of the Suffrage League. Okay, so the next thing that happens is, now that Ellen Robinson is here and seems to have made some type of impression, she doesn't want to just let it go. And it doesn't appear that locals want to let it go either after what happens at the reunion. And in September of 1916, through her connections, we're sure, Elizabeth Lewis, who's the vice president of the Virginia Equal Suffrage League, and who's pictured here, and Lila Valentine, who we're going to talk about on the next slide, who's president of the Virginia Suffrage League, come to Shenandoah County. Now, Elizabeth comes first, we think. She comes to Strasburg, and then to Woodstock, both on September 11th, 1916, and gives two addresses, one at the Academy in Strasburg and one at the courthouse. The Strasburg News reported that the address in their town, the audience was small, but the address was very much enjoyed, which means there had to have been someone there who was a supporter. The Shenandoah Herald, which we see here, reports that she made a strong address that was strongly received by the people who were there, and that they were interested in the subject, but it doesn't give an idea of how many people were present. Now, what's odd about that is every other event that happens at the courthouse gets major attention and would have gotten the number of people who were there and the locals that were there. And none of that's here. And in fact, this is a little tiny article buried at the bottom of page 3 in the Shenandoah Herald. So again, that newspaper effort to kind of ignore or just cover up the suffrage movement. But this had to have been big enough that at least some mention would have been necessary. And we know that when she came here in September 15, 1916, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, that there were quite a few local supporters. One doesn't just get someone of this magnitude without supporters already being here. And especially like financial support and moral support for Ellen to be able to host her when she was here, and to host her at the Academy in Strasburg, and to host her at the courthouse. So there has to be some story that's missing here. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. A little bit later in September, Lila comes. Now, Lila Valentine, like I said, she's the president of the Virginia Suffrage League. So we went vice president of this organization with thousands of members from across the state to now the president, who comes here, we're sure on the train, to the Hottel Holtzman in Woodstock. Now, she only gives one address on September 26, 1916, and it gets an even smaller notice than the first one at the courthouse. But for there to be a follow-up visit would have to mean that the Vice President Lewis's visit earlier was somewhat of a success. So we know that at least something good came as a result of the first visit. All right, so then to follow this up, even more interest is the fact that at the September 14th address at the courthouse, Elon Hinkle of the Shenandoah Valley newspaper in Newmarket decided to attend. Now, Elon, like the other editors of the newspapers, of which there would have been 5 in Shenandoah County, was against suffrage. And it's barely obvious. And Elon, in his paper on September 14th, noticed that he listened to Lewis's address at the courthouse and observed again that women weren't interested in voting because they didn't have time. And Lewis must have found out about that. We don't know how, but in October, she writes back, and surprisingly, Elon prints the letter that she writes. It's like what we would today call a letter to the editor. And he prints the full thing and she makes 3 very important declarations. And this is the only written evidence that we currently have showing the kind of the views of suffrage on a local level. Now, of course, she's from the state of Virginia. She represents a larger organization. But the reality is, if she's writing this in a local paper, there must be some local connection to her, between her views and what the suffrage acts that we have yet to see believe in. And she says three things. First, she thanks him for letting her come to the valley and says that she was privileged to bring such good tidings to our beautiful and historic valley as a way to butter up Elon and Hinkle and his readers. But it doesn't take her long to get into the meat of the thing. When she says that giving women the right to vote, that would be genuine democracy. That there is no real democracy in the country until women have the right to vote. And at the very end, she responds with a direct rebuttal to this argument that women are not interested in voting and says, I am sure, talking of the women, they will gladly add to their present duties. And that, like I said, that's printed on October 5th, 1916 in the Shenandoah Valley. So now we kind of have this little bit of a picture that in 1920, there were a lot of women voters, and that something happened to spark this suffrage movement. Enough that these two women would come and give addresses. So, but what's going on with the locals? What are local women thinking? So we know that at least some of them were thinking about the right to vote. Because when Lewis and Valentine come to Shenandoah County, they came and were able to form, or most likely were invited to come here to help form, one chapter of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia, and quite possibly two, though it's not really clear. We do know that there is correspondence in the Library of Virginia listed under two chapters' names. But in examining that correspondence, some of which we can see here, it appears to be one chapter with individuals living in Strasburg and Woodstock. So most likely there was this one Shenandoah County chapter. We know it was officially founded on September 26, 1916. And this document on the left is the proof of that. This Equal Suffrage League letter was sent in the 1930s when Valentine, who by then worked for the state, was trying to collect information on the history of the Virginia Suffrage League. And she sends this letter with a list of those people who were the first members of the Shenandoah County League. The typed ones being from Woodstock, and these handwritten ones being from either Strasburg or Lebanon Church. And we believe, though we don't know for certain, that the Lebanon Church connection, the Strasburg connection, is from Ellen Robinson. She's not on this list because she was already a member, but we're guessing she, probably through her local connections, was able to recruit them. But this gives us the names of all the people who were there as leaders of this suffrage league initially. Now, this isn't all the members. This isn't the officers and the major members. But we do know that at least some of them existed. And we know from the very scarce newspaper evidence that they existed through the time of the constitutional suffrage amendment. So they were in existence for at least 4 years and were active for at least 4 years. But no evidence of their activities appears in the newspaper, and there are no surviving written records, at least locally or at the state level. And we're going to talk in a minute about who's on these lists. The other thing that comes about, you see on the right here, is a petition that eventually comes from Ellen Robinson of Shenandoah County individuals who support women's suffrage. And we'll talk more about this, but these two documents, are the only surviving documents in the Woodstock and Strasburg Equal Suffrage League of Virginia records. But they give us a lot of information. They prove the existence of the chapters. They give us names of supporters, of Suffrage League members. And we're going to be able to talk about them in depth now because these, really there's 4 documents in the Woodstock folder and 6 in the Strasburg one exist. Okay, so that 1916 list of the Suffrage League. So here's the names. There are 5 from Strasburg and 11 from Woodstock. And we're going to talk about all of them here in depth. So the first one is Clyde Harris Warner. Now, Clyde is not from Shenandoah County. Her husband was the farm demonstration agent, or what we now know as the extension agent. She had 2 years of college and is from West Virginia. And eventually the 2 of them move back to West Virginia sometime after 1920. We're assuming after he got a new job there as their extension agent, because he shows up in 1930 having that profession in West Virginia. Annie Rangley is the secretary. She was a stenographer in a law office. She had been to high school for 4 years, lived on Muhlenberg Street, was unmarried, and was 30 years old in 1916. Nettie Hockman Maphis Spoot. Nettie had 3 years of high school, also lived on Muhlenberg Street, was 48, and her husband was a doctor. Rebecca Robinson Paxton. She is listed as a housewife. She was 16. Her husband managed a lime kiln, and they lived on Court Street in 1916. Annie Williams Riddleberger. She was 41, a housewife, and from Georgia, who had 2 years of college. The next 2, Miss E.W. Watson and Miss E.L. Wonder, we have not been able to trace. All of the names on the correspondence listed individuals this way by the names of their husbands. So it did take some effort on our part to track them, and we've been unable to find anyone in the census records that directly lines up to that we can prove are these 2 women. The next one we know about is Mabel Lee Walton. Mabel Lee in 1916 was 32. She lived on Muhlenberg Street with her father. And she later becomes the president of the Tri-Sig sorority, which has her headquarters in her house on Muhlenberg Street today. Of note, skipping ahead to the very last name on the list, H.L. Walton. H.L. Walton was Mabel Lee's father, and he is the only male to appear on the list. But it's noted that he was a prominent businessman, and it wasn't unusual for prominent members of the community who were men, who they could be recruited as supporters, to be members of the Suffrage League, because it gave credibility to the local and the state organizations. The next woman under Mabel Lee is Eleanor Hollingsworth Grable. Now, Eleanor, she's 25. She had 1 year of college. She later marries an insurance agent. Her sister is listed as a voter in 1920. She's not. And she is the daughter of the editor of the Shenandoah Herald. So we know that despite his opposition, that his daughter was, supportive of the suffrage movement. So we don't have any evidence of what that relationship looked like, but at least there's some type of conflict. Would have been some type of conflict in that family. And then the last woman on this list, Jenny Shield Judson, she's 67. She's a housewife from Illinois, and she is the only person on this list who doesn't make it to the 1920 election. She dies, actually later in 1916. Like I said, we don't actually have any evidence of any of these women voting, but considering the fact that only a few registration lists from the time survive, including only half the names from Woodstock, it's quite possible, and I probably believe that all of these women would have gone to the polls in 1920. The 5 people on the list from Strasburg, we have Corinne Miller. She's only 17 in 1916. She's from Ohio, has 3 years of high school, and later marries a veterinarian. Jessie Balthus Farney, she's 41. She's a 7th grade graduate. Her husband becomes the town clerk in Strasburg later. She's sometimes listed as a seamstress and sometimes as a housewife. So she may have had a profession. Emma Stickley, she's a 42-year-old housewife. Rosa Rudolph, she's 31. She's a practical nurse, excuse me, who later marries a farmer in the St. Stephen's Church area after suffrage. And then Ellen Robinson, who we've already talked about, who we believe is probably the organizer. We know she was the district president. She's living with her mother, and she's 44 in 1916. So what we can learn from all that information about these people, with the exception of 1 or 2 people, all of these women are what could be considered upper middle class. They're kind of the prominent women of Shenandoah County. About half of them are married and half of them are unmarried. All of them have really good educations. To go to high school at the time required a tuition, and to go to college, of course, was even more. And there's a much higher percentage of women who go to high school and who go to college among these women than the general population. There's also no African Americans on this list. They're all white. So we can tell upper class, educated, wealthier, white women are the people that make up these 2 groups. And here's 2 pictures of them. The 2 pictures that we were able to find. Eleanor Hollingsworth Grable is pictured here. This is from the Morrison collection. That's actually probably around 1916. And then here, that's a picture of Mabel Lee Walton, taken from the Tri-Sig, a blog about the Tri-Sig sorority, of which he was a charter member in 1904. Okay, so if you remember back a couple slides ago, we talked about this petition that Ellen Robinson brings to Shenandoah County. What happens is, once the suffrage amendment, the women's suffrage amendment, goes to the federal government, to Congress for approval, the state Equal Suffrage League makes an attempt to gather a petition to pressure the General Assembly to support the suffrage amendment. And each district in Virginia is given a quota. Ellen Robinson, as the District 1 chair in that period, she is the one responsible for that petition that we looked at earlier. We think probably in the summer of 1918 it was distributed in Shenandoah County. It does not have a date on it. We know it was after the suffrage amendment was first proposed in Congress. But again, there's no newspaper reporting, no evidence except for what comes from the files at the Library of Virginia and from the Suffrage League. We do know that it was reportedly the quickest, she was reportedly the quickest to fill her quota in the state of Virginia. And she ends up with 120 women and 78 men who sign, which is a pretty good number, considering the fact that they all list Strasbourg as their address. And there are, on that list, of course, there's a separate women's list and a separate men's list. And there are 15 husbands and wives on there. So 63 men and 105 women were listed on there individually. And this petition is, again, in support of women's suffrage. So we know at least 198 people in Shenandoah County, plus the people who were in the Suffrage League that didn't sign, were suffrage supporters, which is a pretty good number for Shenandoah County. Here's a picture of one of the people who signed. This is Grace Hottel Everly. Now, Grace is born in Lebanon Church and would have been living in Lebanon Church up until she gets married in 1917. So Grace probably, if our theory holds true that Ellen lived in Lebanon Church, would have known Ellen. And that's how the connection for the petition would have happened. She's born in 1875 and lives until 1976. Now, and again, she marries a potter, so it gives her some affluence. But he drowns in 1918, and she becomes much poorer, and eventually ends up taking in boarders, and spends her last days, really of limited means. What is interesting to note, though, is her mother-in-law is on the 1920 voter list that is printed in Strasbourg. She's not. Again, we don't know if that's just because she was on a different list. But we can tell that there's a lot of connections between these people that we know supported suffrage and other people in the community who end up voting in 1920. So we can guess that there's probably some stronger group than is really we know about or that is talked about. Okay, so what do we know about these suffragettes in Shenandoah County? Again, no records exist for their league, either locally or at the state. But we do have one bit of proof that shows that they remained active throughout the time period from 1916, when they were formed, until after women get the right to vote. And that's this article. This article is from September 7th, 1920. It was printed in the Shenandoah Herald, and it talks about the Virginia League of Voters, which was the name adopted by the Equal Suffrage League after suffrage was granted. And we know that they had a class at the courthouse on good citizenship before the 1920 election. Now, the paper doesn't list this specifically, but most likely it was for women. And we can see that some of the same names, Warner, Williams, Riddleberger, H.L. Walton, are all listed as being present. So we know that the league had to have been active enough for there still be officers and a membership 4 years after it was founded. So while we know very little about the suffrage league itself, we know a little bit more about the women who actually go to polls in the 1920 election. And these women really are the people who took advantage of this new right to vote. They really are the people who utilize suffrage once it's passed, having lived through most of their lives not being able to participate in the voter franchise. So how do we know about these people? How do we find out who they are? First of all, voter registration list. Poll books from the voter registrar's office exist for Newmarket and one of the two Woodstock precincts. We also here have two books from Mount Olive precinct, which would have covered a wide area north and south of that community. And we also know that both the Strasburg News and the Shenandoah Valley printed lists of names of women who registered to vote in 1920. And from that, we've been able to identify 493 names of women we think voted in 1920, or at least they were registered and had paid the poll tax. So out of 2,067, that doesn't seem like a lot, but it really is a pretty tremendous number to know the names and to be able to identify the history, the stories behind some of these people. And I will give, after, I guess, bad mouthing them in terms of their resistance to the suffrage movement, the newspapers some credit, at least from a research perspective, that they printed these names, which was something unusual. The other three newspapers in the county didn't do that, which then brings the question, why would they print these names? Why were the women listed in the newspaper as being voters? Possibly it's because it was a novelty. Women hadn't voted yet. So suddenly it was something new. But they didn't list any other new voters. It was something they only did for women. So it's also possible that it was a form of intimidation, because if we remember, the newspapers, one doesn't just change their mind. They still oppose women voting for a whole variety of reasons. So it's quite possible that they printed the names as a way to identify that these are the people who are suddenly going to the polls and that are perhaps suffragettes, or in some way could be identified as suffragettes, as these new voters, because we know through some oral histories that men, especially husbands and fathers, didn't always like their wives and daughters going to vote, even through the 1940s in Shenandoah County and later. So by printing these names, at least some of that family pressure we talked about maybe could be brought on these women. So again, we don't know that for sure, but there has to be some of that, and probably mixed with the novelty of it, that we're going to identify who these women are, that are suddenly breaking this society norm that we said they wouldn't want to. And who are some of these women? We did a lot of digging on this list, and we're really able to find more information on several hundred in various degrees. So we picked this list of 12 as kind of a representative of the ones we found. The first one here is Nanny Roberta Morgan. Now, Nanny is unique because she's one of 4 African Americans who's listed as registering. To be a woman and to be an African American woman who registers had to be a big deal. And one would have had to have been pretty brave to do that, because we know that if there was anything that the local leaders liked less than a woman voter, was an African American voter. That's why there's only 4 on the list. But she did. She could read and write. She was a housewife who was married to a barber. So that gives her a little bit of influence, and her status would have helped her as she made that attempt to vote. She lived on Water Street in Newmarket in 1920. She's widowed by 1930, but lets us know that she had some money. She owned her own house, which was valued at $3,000, and she's running a boarding house in 1930. So she obviously, she doesn't remarry. So she must have had some desire to live independently, to be her own woman. And it's also possible that she's mulatto, which would have given her a little bit more, I guess, respect, though that's probably not a good word, in terms of when she made that attempt to register. We don't have a lot of in-depth information on any of the other 3 women, African-American women, who registered to vote in 1920, except for one of them lived with Nanny. So we assume there probably was some type of connection there, but we don't know for sure. The second one on this list is Arlene Keister. Now, Arlene, who's pictured here, she's from Pennsylvania. She was well educated. She had at least 2, maybe 4 years of college. We think she graduated in 1914 and also attended a private school. And in 1918, she marries E.E. Keister, who's the editor of the Strasburg News, which, as I mentioned, was fairly opposed to women voting. So, again, just like the connection between the Graybals, where the editor of the paper opposed women voting, and one of their close relatives, in this case his wife, supported it. The next person on our list is Abby Lee Hinkle. Abby's from Newmarket. She lives with her mother, who is listed as a farmer, meaning most likely that her father had died. He must have been a farmer, and her mother just kept the farm going, which shows a little bit of an independent streak. She's well educated. She attended first a school on Congress Street. She was an organist at the Lutheran Church in Newmarket, and in 1920 was a music teacher, teaching out of her home. Though later she gives that up and goes back living with her mother at the farm, but she's very involved in the community. She's a charter member of the Garden Club, and she works at Shenandoah up until the time of her death. So again, she never marries, so she had some organizational skills, must have been somewhat of a leader in her community. The next 2 people, Martha and Mary Pfeiffer, both of their parents were farmers, they're sisters, and we think possibly twins, that we don't know for sure. And both are listed as teachers in 1920. So this is Martha. Like I said, she was initially listed as a teacher in 1920, but she later goes back to school and becomes a nurse. We know a lot about her because she ends up getting married later in life, but is committed to Western State Mental Hospital in Stanton. The reason for her admission is listed as depression. So we don't really know what her symptoms were or what may have been wrong with her, but she dies there, which would probably been a pretty wretched existence in the 1940s, living in Western State. Her sister Mary, she also has a college degree. She starts out as a teacher and she gets married here locally. They move to Winchester, and she dies there and is buried in Winchester. Martha Hoffman, who's the next person on the list. Martha is unmarried, but she becomes a homeowner. She's 4 years of high school, and she had her job. We don't know what her job was, but she was making $75 a week in 1940, which was pretty significant. So she obviously was able to leverage her education to make a good living for herself. Ellen Baker. Ellen is the daughter of Ephraim Baker, who owns Baker's Store, off Back Road near Mount Olive. In 1920, she's living with her mother and brother. Her father's dead, and her mother's running the store. So obviously, even though she's listed as a housekeeper in that census, she would have most likely been a merchant, a store operator, helping her mother. She dies and is buried at St. Stephen's Church, and we know that she's educated, having attended what was called the Virginia Normal Music School in Newmarket, which for someone to go to music school would have meant they would have had some means. Nora's born in Mount Clifton. She later moves to Woodstock when she gets married. She has 3 years, or when she later moves to Woodstock, never gets married, 3 years of high school. And then finally, Roberta, or Robbie, as she's called. Now, Robbie, she had 7 years of school, so she graduated from 7th grade. She marries a Charles Heater, who was a fireman on the railroad in Strasburg. She divorces him sometime before 1940, and in that year is living in Strasburg and has a boarder. And she later dies in Rockville, Maryland. So again, we can see some patterns here. Well-educated women, with one exception, white, all had some influence, even the African-American nanny, Morgan. And all have what appears to be a little bit of an independent streak. All of them did things for themselves in a way that may not be stereotypical of the time period, or at least what we think to be stereotypical. So what do we learn from all this examination of these women and the Suffrage League and the petition and all that? We learned that resistance was not universal in Shenandoah County. The newspaper editors, the local political elite, try to make it appear as though it was, but especially among women and obviously among some men, the resistance to suffrage was not universal. So a lot of women and a lot of men appear to have been supporters. There was an active equal suffrage movement. Not only are these women maybe silently approving, and then when the time to come to vote, go vote in large numbers, some of them were very active in the suffrage movement. And we know that the people who are listed as charter members, a lot of their relatives and neighbors end up being on that 1920 voter list. So we can assume there has to be some connection, that these members of the suffrage movement, the suffrage chapters, had to have some influence. And we can draw the conclusion that probably some of those 2,067 women, especially the ones with connection, may have been active supporters. We see, though, that a few did drive the movement. Ellen Robinson being the major one, who was able to bring these big names to the area to get at least a little bit of attention in the newspapers, which would have otherwise ignored the suffrage movement. But she couldn't have done it by herself. She couldn't have done it even just with those 11 other supporters on that list. So there had to be other women and other men, because the men would have been the people who had the levers of power, the people that could have given permission to use the courthouse or the Strasbourg Academy. So we know that both women and men had to have been fairly active in the suffrage movement. We also know a lot of women voted. I'm just now starting to discover how high that percentage is. I mean, we could assume, of the roughly 10,000 people in Shenandoah County in 1920, if half of them are women, not all of those women would have been eligible to vote. So it has to be a huge percentage. I don't know what the total number of women who were eligible to vote by age and things in 1920 were, but the number who actually went out and registered has to have been high as a percentage. We do know resistance continued. Those oral histories and the way the newspapers talked about it, once suffrage is legal, it's hard to say don't go vote in public, but the way they talked about the women voters, the fact that they listed those names, the fact that we get these stories of women being told not to go vote by family members, means that resistance continued even after 1920, because they would have had to have been viewed as a threat to the established political order. We know that sometime after 1920, that organized suffrage group is dissolved because there's no response to those requests for information about the League's history. So unfortunately, the local chapters, it doesn't appear that anything really survives that helps us understand any more about what they did. There were big connections between those who were involved. They lived on some of the same streets. They were related to each other. They certainly did some of the same things. And we know education was a driver of participation. Again, a large percentage of these women voters and the people involved in the suffrage league were well educated. They had money and they were relatively upper class. Now, when we get to 1920, some of those middle class and wealthy factors fade away just because of the total number of women who vote. But we do know that those three things really drove a lot of that participation early on. And what's this legacy of this women's suffrage movement, both in Shenandoah County and nationally? The first is that it was an incomplete legacy. 4 African American women are on that list out of what would have been several hundred in Shenandoah County. African Americans are left out of the suffrage movement in terms of the victory in 1920. And it's not until the 1960s that we really see African American men and women start to get the right to vote. The passage of the federal suffrage amendment also didn't give the right to vote to all women. We talked about how families a lot of times prevented women from voting. So we know it takes several decades before there's really full women's suffrage, even excluding the racial issue. And then finally, the legacy of equal rights. Equal right to vote doesn't mean full equal rights. And that's still a conflict and a movement that continues to this day, is this effort for women to get equal rights to employment and wages and a variety of other issues that aren't just fixed by women finally having the right to vote. All right, so I'm going to try to get out of this, and we'll see if anyone has any questions. I can just let's see if anyone had any questions in the chat. All right, so we had a couple questions here, and I'll try to get those first. So we had a question of whether the Riddleberger on the petition was related to H.H. Riddleberger. We think yes, but that's by marriage. But that's not something that I've been able to confirm. And we know that, to follow up on Tim's comment, that the Riddlebergers, there were Riddlebergers in Strasbourg who were separate from the Riddlebergers of Woodstock who appear on the voter list. See other. So we'll follow up with the names of the women here in a couple minutes. Dennis, I think you're right that the first women elected to the Board of Supervisor was Cynthia Dellinger, though I don't know the year of that. And Robert asked, make up the largest group of voters, more women born than men. I don't know, that's a good question, whether or not the higher percentage of women vote gives them an edge over other groups. I don't know, that's a question that I think we're probably still discussing as a society. So, all right, and I'm gonna, does anyone have any questions that they wanted to ask live, or I haven't seen any ones on Facebook, but we'll try to unmute everyone. So if you have a question, just try to throw it out there if I can figure out how this works.
Very wonky, very
We can unmute ourselves one at a time.
Also had a real sense of humor then, and I don't think.
So if you have a question, you can unmute yourself, or I think we've unlocked that, or you can raise your hand if you have one.
Really see that sense of humor.
All right. So does no one has any other?
Zach, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Susan Hines. I had a question. Like when you went back at the very beginning, you like showed all the districts, like the Stonewall and the Lee and everything.
Right.
It's hard for me to keep in mind like what areas those districts encompass. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Okay, so let's see if I'm going to try to bring that back up. Maybe share screen. All right, so can everyone see that here where Susan was asking about the list? So on this article, they run from south to north. So Lee is Newmarket, Ashby is Mount Jackson, Madison's Edinburgh, Johnston and Stonewall kind of are in the Woodstock-ish area. The town is sometimes divided, and then Davis is Strasbourg.
So I can't see it.
Oh, you can't see it? Okay.
No.
Let's try one more.
But okay, I'm sorry to make you repeat it.
No, that's
but
all right.
That's important.
Can you see it now, Susan?
Oh, yes, definitely. I hope everybody else can.
Yeah.
So
this, like
from
I
the
said,
top.
it goes from south to north. And the one thing you'll notice on here is the numbers are relatively equal.
Yeah.
There's some discrepancy. We know the populations were much different. Obviously, Strasbourg's bigger than Edinburgh.
Right.
But even among the smaller districts, the numbers are relatively equal.
That is so cool. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Let's see if I can get back. Okay. And there was also the question about whether the slides would be available. We hope, as long as we did it right, that they will be available on our the Historical Society and Library's Facebook page. And at some point, we may be able to download those if I can get that done. And we'll see how Barbara, if she wants to send those out. So.
Sure. If you wanted to put it on the Historical Society's website, that would be another way for those who don't use Facebook.
We'll try to get that done, or at the maybe least see if we can put it on YouTube and get a link up there. And we'll let
Nice.
everyone know once that's there.
Nice.
Zach, this is Dennis. I just put in the Zoom chat, so people on Facebook might not have seen it. Just want to mention that Historical Society has a book for sale published earlier this year called The Campaign for Women's Suffrage in Virginia, published February 2020. And it's for sale. It's 209 pages hardcover, and it's by History Press. So we do have that at the courthouse, and you can, of course, also order it from us. Thank you.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's a great resource. We also have that for checkout through the library. And I, just wanted to follow up too that I always like to mention that all the resources we use here, except for the 2 files I did access at the Library of Virginia, are available here at the county library once we reopen. So if anyone wants to learn more, because this was just, this deep into these things, we'll have this available. And we're also working to make that list available in a better format than just an Excel sheet. The list of those 400 and some women who we've identified as voters. So I hope, be on the lookout for that. It will probably be a while, but hopefully we'll have that available. So,
Zach, if I could ask a question, this is Susan
Yes,
Hines
ma'am.
again. So when you access the Shenandoah Valley newspaper, where do you go? Do you go to Charlottesville? You go to UVA, Richmond?
that's here at the county library in Edinburgh. We have all of the local newspapers from that time period here on microfilm, which means they're accessible but not searchable. So when I say that we spend a lot of time trying to find these articles,
Ah,
yeah, and there's a lot more to be done because it requires a lot of effort to just look through to find these things. So, but they are there.
gotcha. I didn't know that you had that paper.
You do, yes.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. All right, and without any other questions, I guess, you can always contact me, but I'll turn it back over to Barbara for wrap up.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Zach. This is a fascinating subject. And I had a chance to look through the list of the suffrage people and the women and the registration list, and just really enjoyed it. It's a great little view into life at that time. So thank you very much, Zach. And thanks for everybody who attended this evening. It's great.
Well done. Thanks.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
All right.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one.
Bye, Zach.